The Jackson County Courthouse stood tall and imposing against the clear blue sky. Its stone steps had witnessed thousands of stories over the decades, some ending in justice, others in heartbreak. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marissa Bennett climbed those steps with a mixture of excitement and nervousness flowing through her veins. Marissa wasn't just any visitor to the courthouse. The 28-year-old had worked incredibly hard to get where she was. A third-year law student at State University, top of her class, and now securing one of the most competitive internships in the county. Growing up in the small apartment on the east side of town with her grandmother after losing both parents young, Marissa had defied every expectation placed on her. "You got your notebook?" her grandmother had asked that morning, pressing a travel mug of coffee into her hands before she left. At 76, Grandma Rose still fussed over Marissa like she was heading off to her first day of school. "Yes, Grandma," Marissa had laughed, patting her messenger bag. "And my pens, my phone charger, and yes, I'll remember to eat lunch." Now, as she pushed through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B, Marissa felt the weight of possibility. This internship could open doors. Judge Harold Winters was known as fair but demanding. Getting to observe his courtroom was an education you couldn't get from textbooks. The courtroom was already filling with the day's business. Lawyers in various states of hurry shuffled papers and whispered to clients. Court officers stood at attention, their badges catching the light from the tall windows. Marissa found an empty spot in the back row of the gallery and settled in, pulling out her notebook and favorite pen. "All rise." The bailiff's voice rang out as Judge Winters entered, his black robe flowing behind him. For the next 2 hours, Marissa watched and took detailed notes. A property dispute, a small claims case, a bail hearing. She studied how the judge handled each situation, how he spoke to the lawyers, how he addressed those appearing before him. This was real law, messy, human, complicated. Nothing like the clean hypotheticals they discussed in class. During a brief recess, Marissa flipped back through her notes. Her professor would expect a full report on what she'd observed. She was so absorbed in her writing that she barely noticed the increasing noise near the courtroom entrance. It started as raised voices, then came the shuffle of feet. Marissa looked up just as the commotion spilled into the courtroom itself. A man was struggling with court officers, shouting about his brother's case. "It's not fair. You're railroading him. I need to speak to the judge." People in the gallery turned to watch. Some stood up to get a better view. Others moved away from the disturbance. The officers were trying to restrain the man without causing a scene, but he was making that impossible. More officers rushed in from a side door. In their haste to control the situation, they created chaos. People were standing, moving, blocking pathways. Marissa stood too, gathering her things, thinking maybe she should leave and come back after things calmed down. That's when it happened. An officer, built like a linebacker and moving fast, charged through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the disturbance. He didn't see Marissa. Didn't see her stepping into the aisle, trying to move out of the way. The impact was sudden and hard. The officer's shoulder caught Marissa square in the chest, sending her flying backward. Her notebook went one way, her bag another. She landed hard on the wooden floor. The breath knocked out of her, pain shooting through her back where she'd hit the edge of a bench. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Even the shouting man stopped mid-sentence. Judge Winters stood up behind the bench, his face darkening with anger. "Officer, what in God's name is going on in my courtroom?" The officer who'd struck Marissa barely glanced back. "Sorry, Your Honor, trying to handle a situation." Then he was moving again, joining his colleagues in subduing the disruptive man. Marissa lay there, struggling to catch her breath, humiliation washing over her as everyone stared. Finally, a woman sitting nearby leaned down to help. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked, her face creased with concern. "I think so," Marissa managed, though the pain in her back suggested otherwise. As she slowly got to her feet, retrieving her scattered belongings, Marissa felt something shift inside her. This wasn't right. Being knocked down, literally knocked down, in a place meant to uphold justice and dignity. The casual disregard. The assumption that maintaining order meant some people could be collateral damage. She straightened her jacket, ignoring the throbbing pain, and instead of leaving, she returned to her seat. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began writing again. But now she was documenting a different kind of lesson than she had expected to learn today. From the bench, Judge Winters was watching. Few noticed the way his eyes lingered on the young woman who'd been knocked down, yet returned to her seat with quiet dignity. Fewer still would have guessed how that moment would connect their futures. "Order," the judge called, gaveling the courtroom back to attention. "We will have order in this court." As the proceedings resumed, Marissa wrote steadily, her pen pressing harder into the paper than before. She hadn't come this far to be knocked down. Not in law school, not in this courtroom, and not in life. What she didn't know then was that this moment, this painful, humiliating moment, would become the first step on a path that would lead her not just to the bar, but to the bench itself, and the officers who moved through the courtroom with such casual authority. They had no idea that the woman they'd knocked to the ground would one day be the one wielding the gavel. No idea at all that their paths would cross again, with the power dynamic completely reversed. But that was still to come. For now, Marissa simply wrote, her back aching, her resolve hardening, while Judge Winters called the next case and life in courtroom 4B continued its steady flow toward what everyone there would have called justice. The courthouse bathroom was empty when Marissa finally let the tears come. She leaned against the cold tile wall, her back throbbing where she'd hit the bench. The bathroom's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, much like the system she'd just experienced from a perspective she hadn't anticipated. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, splashing cold water on her face. In the mirror, her reflection showed red-rimmed eyes and a resolve that was quickly replacing the shock. When she emerged, court was still in session, but Marissa didn't go back inside. Instead, she made her way to the administration office on the 3rd floor. The clerk behind the desk looked up with practiced indifference. "I need to file a complaint," Marissa said, her voice steadier than she felt. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, barely looked up from her computer. "What kind of complaint?" "Against a court officer. For excessive force." That got the clerk's attention. She peered at Marissa over reading glasses. "You want to complain about one of our officers? Good luck with that." She slid a form across the counter. "Fill this out. Someone will review it. Eventually." Marissa took the form and found a seat in the waiting area. As she wrote out the details of what had happened, a man in a suit approached the clerk's desk. From his conversation, Marissa gathered he was one of the assistant district attorneys. The clerk's demeanor changed completely, all smiles and helpfulness. "What you writing there? A novel?" The question came from beside her, startling Marissa. The speaker was an older black woman, probably in her 60s, dressed in a court officer's uniform but with captain's insignia. She had kind eyes that contrasted with her stern posture. "A complaint," Marissa answered honestly. The captain nodded, unsurprised. "Let me guess. Officer Reynolds. Built like a bulldozer, moves like one too." Marissa looked up in surprise. "I don't know his name." "Don't need to. I saw what happened in there." The captain sat down next to her. "I'm Captain Wilson. Been working these courts for 30 years. I'm Marissa Bennett, law student intern." She gestured to the form. "Soon to be persona non grata, I imagine." Captain Wilson laughed softly. "Maybe or maybe not." She nodded at Marissa's form. "Make sure you ask for the security footage. Every inch of that courtroom is recorded. Don't let them tell you different." Marissa quickly added that request to her form. "Will it make any difference?" Captain Wilson's face grew serious. "Depends what you're looking for. Justice, that's complicated around here, but a record of what happened, that's something." Before she could say more, Captain Wilson was called away. She left with a nod that somehow felt like solidarity. After submitting her complaint, Marissa headed to the university library to research courthouse incident protocols. 3 hours and dozens of pages of notes later, she was interrupted by her phone ringing. It was Professor Thomas, her internship supervisor. "Marissa, I just got a concerning call from the courthouse. There was some kind of incident today?" Marissa's stomach dropped. "Yes, Professor. I was knocked down by a court officer during a disturbance in Judge Winters' courtroom. I filed a complaint." There was a long pause. "You filed a complaint? Against a court officer? During your first week of internship?" "I did what I thought was right," Marissa said quietly. "Judge Winters wants to see you tomorrow morning at 8:30 before court." Professor Thomas sounded worried. "Marissa, these relationships with the courts are delicate. Our internship program depends on—" "I understand, Professor. I'll be there." That evening, Marissa's grandmother listened patiently as she explained what had happened. then nodded firmly. You stand your ground. Your grandfather didn't march in Selma for you to be knocked down and say thank you. Marissa slept fitfully, her back still sore. By morning, anxiety had her stomach in knots. But she dressed carefully in her most professional outfit, a navy pantsuit she'd saved for months to buy. Judge Winter's chambers were wood-paneled and book-lined, imposing in a way that matched the man himself. At 64, he had the gravitas of someone who had spent decades making decisions that changed lives. Ms. Bennett, he said without preamble, you filed a complaint about yesterday's incident. Yes, Your Honor. I've reviewed the security footage. He pressed a button on a remote, and his computer monitor showed the courtroom from the day before. Marissa watched herself being knocked down, the officer continuing on without a backward glance. From this angle, it looked even worse. I've been on the bench 15 years, Judge Winters said, turning off the monitor. I've seen a lot of what passes for justice in these halls. He studied her for a moment. You're right to be angry. This was not what Marissa had expected. The officer has been reprimanded. But that's not enough, is it? No, Your Honor, it isn't, Marissa said, finding her voice. It's about dignity. About who gets knocked down and forgotten in our justice system. About who matters. Judge Winters nodded slowly. I thought you might say something like that. Your professors speak highly of you, Ms. Bennett. They say you have a mind for the law but also a heart for justice. Those don't always go together in my experience. He pulled a folder from his desk. I've been considering taking on a dedicated clerk for my remaining time on the bench. Your professor tells me you're top of your class. Would you be interested? Marissa was stunned. You want me to clerk for you? After I filed a complaint about your courtroom? The judge almost smiled. Because you filed a complaint. Because you stood your ground. Because this system needs people who know the difference between law and justice, and care enough to fight for both. As she left his chambers, Marissa passed Officer Reynolds in the hallway. He didn't recognize her, didn't remember knocking her down the day before, but one day she thought he would. One day, he'd know exactly who she was, back in the clerk's office to withdraw her complaint. Now that the judge had addressed it personally, Marissa ran into Captain Wilson again. How'd it go with the judge? The captain asked. He offered me a clerkship. Captain Wilson nodded approvingly. Told you it might not go like you expected. Winters is one of the good ones. Tough but fair. Why did you help me? Marissa asked suddenly. You don't know me. The captain's expression turned reflective. 30 years ago, I was the first black woman to wear this uniform in this courthouse. Nobody helped me. She straightened her badge. Changed that policy a long time ago. As Captain Wilson walked away, Marissa realized something important. This wasn't just about her getting knocked down in a courtroom. It was about who got back up, who helped them rise, and what they did with the chance to stand tall again. The clerkship with Judge Winters would be demanding, challenging, perhaps even more difficult than the law school courses she'd aced. But it would also be a step, an unexpected one, toward changing the system that had so casually knocked her down. Tomorrow she would begin. Today she needed to tell Grandma Rose the news. The first 6 months of Marissa's clerkship with Judge Winters passed in a blur of early mornings and late nights. She'd arrive at the courthouse before sunrise, reviewing case files while the hallways were still dark and empty. Often she'd still be there when the cleaning crew came through, nodding hello as they emptied trash cans and swept floors. You're working too hard, Judge Winters told her one evening, finding her still at her desk well past 7. The law will still be here tomorrow. So will the people waiting for justice, Marissa replied without looking up from the brief she was analyzing. The judge studied her for a moment, then pulled up a chair. Tell me why you went to law school. Marissa finally set down her pen. The question seemed simple, but she knew it wasn't. My brother got 10 years for something his white friend got probation for. Same crime, same evidence, different judges, different outcomes. Judge Winters nodded. He'd heard similar stories countless times, but this one mattered because it was hers. I wanted to understand how that could happen in a system that claims to be blind, Marissa continued. I thought if I understood it, maybe I could help fix it. And now that you've seen the system from the inside? He asked quietly. Marissa looked around the office, at the stacks of files, each representing someone's worst day or desperate hope. Now I see it's more broken than I thought. But also, more fixable. The judge smiled slightly. That's why I wanted you here. Most clerks either become cynical or naive. You're neither. Over the next weeks, Judge Winters began inviting Marissa to lunch in his chambers. These weren't social occasions, but intense educational sessions. He'd challenge her interpretations of case law, push her to defend positions she hadn't even realized she held, and occasionally share stories from his own journey. "Did you know I was a public defender before I became a prosecutor?" he asked one day over sandwiches from the deli across the street. "No," Marissa admitted. "Most judges came from prosecutorial backgrounds. 3 years. Hardest job I ever had. Also the most important." He took a sip of his iced tea. "You learn more about justice from the people who rarely get it than from those who take it for granted." Slowly, Marissa began to understand that Judge Winters wasn't just giving her a job. He was giving her an education no law school could provide. He was showing her how power worked from the inside, how to navigate a system designed to resist change while appearing to embrace it. One rainy Tuesday, he asked her to sit in on his meeting with the chief judge, something clerks were rarely invited to do. The topic was bail reform, and Judge Winters wanted to implement changes in how the court handled nonviolent offenses. "This is Ms. Bennett, my clerk," he introduced her. "She's done extensive research on bail outcomes across different demographics." The chief judge, a white man in his 70s with a reputation for being old school, barely acknowledged her presence. "Harold, we've discussed this. The county isn't ready for the kind of changes you're proposing." "The data suggests otherwise," Judge Winters replied calmly. "Ms. Bennett, would you share your findings?" Heart-pounding, Marissa presented the analysis she'd been working on for weeks, showing how the current bail system disproportionately kept poor defendants in jail while allowing wealthy ones to go free, regardless of flight risk or community ties. The chief judge listened with thinly veiled impatience. When she finished, he sighed. "Very thorough, young lady. But theory and practice are different things." "These aren't theories, Your Honor," Marissa responded, keeping her voice level despite her rising frustration. "These are people's lives." Later in the hallway, Judge Winters placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well in there." "He didn't listen to a word I said," Marissa replied bitterly. "No, but he heard you. Sometimes that's how change starts. Not with agreement, but with discomfort." The judge checked his watch. "He'll retire next year. The bench will need new blood, new perspectives." That evening, as Marissa recounted the meeting to Grandma Rose over dinner, her grandmother asked a question that caught her off guard. "Have you ever thought about becoming a judge yourself?" Marissa laughed. "I haven't even passed the bar exam yet, Grandma." "That's not what I asked," Rose replied, fixing her with a knowing look. "I asked if you've thought about it." The truth was she hadn't, at least not seriously. The path to judgeship was long and typically reserved for those with connections, resources, and the right pedigree, none of which she had. "I think Judge Winters is grooming you," Rose continued, serving herself more greens. "I think he sees something in you." 2 days later, as if her grandmother had somehow spoken it into existence, Judge Winters called Marissa into his chambers and handed her an application. "The Judicial Mentorship Program," he explained. "It's for law students and new attorneys from underrepresented backgrounds who show promise for the bench. I'd like to nominate you." Marissa stared at the application. "Me, a judge?" "Eventually, yes." Judge Winters sat back in his chair. "The law needs good minds. The bench needs diverse perspectives. And this courthouse." He gestured to the window overlooking the building where she'd been knocked to the ground a year ago. "This courthouse needs someone who remembers what it feels like to be on the floor looking up, not just on the bench looking down." That night, Marissa stayed late, sitting alone in the empty courtroom. She ran her hand along the smooth wood of the judge's bench, trying to imagine herself there. Did she have what it would take? The knowledge, the temperament, the courage? As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed Officer Reynolds standing by the door. He still didn't recognize her, but she remembered him. Not with anger anymore, but with clarity. That moment of being knocked down had led her here, to this possibility she'd never imagined for herself. Closing up? "Ma'am," Reynolds said, impatient to lock the courtroom. "Yes," Marissa replied, looking once more at the bench. "But I'll be back." Over the next months, Judge Winters became more than a boss. He became a mentor, advocate, and ally. He introduced her to other judges, arranged for her to observe specialized courts, and gave her increasingly complex assignments that stretched her legal thinking. "You're going to face Resistance, he told her bluntly one afternoon, after she'd encountered thinly veiled hostility from an older attorney who'd questioned her presence at a judge's conference. Some people won't want you on the bench. They won't say it's because you're young or female or black. They'll find other reasons. Be so good they can't ignore you. Marissa took his advice to heart, working twice as hard, studying judicial ethics and decision-making, attending community meetings to understand the impact of court policies on real people's lives. When she finally passed the bar exam, Judge Winters took her and Grandma Rose out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. He raised a toast that made Marissa's eyes fill with tears. To justice, not as it is but as it could be, and to those brave enough to bridge the gap. Later that night, as she helped her grandmother up the steps to their apartment, Rose squeezed her hand. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said. "He always said you'd change the world." Marissa looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights. "I'm not sure about the world, Grandma, but maybe one courtroom at a time." What neither of them knew then was how soon that chance would come, or how directly it would connect back to that day when a courthouse officer knocked a young law student to the ground and never looked back. 6 years passed like the turning of pages in a well-worn book. Marissa moved from Judge Winters' clerkship to the public defender's office, where she quickly developed a reputation for thorough preparation and unwavering advocacy. The courthouse hallways that once intimidated her became as familiar as her own neighborhood. She knew which elevators ran slow, which security guards would chat while checking your bag, which courtrooms had the squeaky chairs. Most importantly, she knew the judges, their temperaments, preferences, and biases, knowledge that helped her navigate cases for clients who rarely got the benefit of the doubt in a system stacked against them. "You're spending too much time on the Jefferson case," her supervisor warned one evening, finding her still at her desk long after everyone else had gone home. Marissa looked up from the case file spread across her desk. "Mr. Jefferson has been sitting in jail for 8 months on charges that would get dismissed in a heartbeat if he lived across town," her supervisor, a veteran public defender with the perpetually tired eyes of someone who had seen too many losses, sighed. "That's true of half our clients, Marissa. You can't fix the whole system." "Maybe not," she agreed, turning back to her work. "But I can fix this case." The next day in court, Marissa presented evidence that the arresting officer had a history of misconduct complaints and that key testimony had been inconsistent. The judge, not one known for sympathy toward defense motions, actually listened. By the end of the hearing, Mr. Jefferson was walking out the front door of the courthouse, charges dismissed. As Marissa packed up her files, the prosecutor approached. "Nice work, Bennett. You're wasted in the PD's office." "Funny, I was thinking I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied coolly. The truth was more complicated. Marissa loved being a public defender, loved standing beside people facing the overwhelming power of the state, but she was beginning to wonder if she could do more good elsewhere in the system. That question became more urgent when Judge Winters announced his retirement. He was 70 now, ready to spend time with his grandchildren and travel with his wife. At his retirement party, held in the courthouse atrium, he sought Marissa out. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the hallway that led to his courtroom. They walked in companionable silence until they reached courtroom 4B. It was empty now, the lights dimmed, but Marissa could still remember exactly how it felt that first day when she'd been knocked to the floor. "I've recommended you to the governor's judicial selection committee," Judge Winters said without preamble. Marissa turned to him in shock. "What? I'm only 34. I've only been practicing for 6 years. "Age is just a number," he replied. "Experience matters more. And you've got the kind that counts. Seeing the system from the ground up, not the top down." "They'll never appoint me," Marissa said, shaking her head. "I'm too young, too inexperienced on paper, and I've spent my career making prosecutors work for their convictions." Judge Winters smiled. "That's exactly why you should be on the bench. Look, the governor needs to appoint someone who reflects the community. The demographics are changing. The old guard is retiring. It's time." 2 weeks later, to her complete surprise, Marissa received a call from the governor's office requesting an interview for the judicial vacancy. Grandma Rose helped her prepare, sitting at their kitchen table asking mock questions from a list they'd found online. At 82, Rose moved slower now, but her mind was sharp as ever. What if they ask why I want to be a judge? Marissa wondered, pacing nervously. Tell them the truth, Rose replied simply. You want justice to work the same for everyone, not just those with money or power. The interview was held in a conference room at the state capitol. With the selection committee seated around a massive oak table, Marissa recognized several faces. Judges she'd appeared before, attorneys she'd worked with and against. And seated at the far end, the chief judge who had dismissed her bail reform research years ago. For 2 hours, they questioned her about her legal experience, her judicial philosophy, how she would handle conflicts of interest. Some questions were clearly designed to trip her up or highlight her youth. But Marissa answered with the confidence of someone who knew why she was there. Near the end, the chief judge leaned forward. Ms. Bennett, some would say you lack the necessary experience for this position. How would you respond to that criticism? Marissa met his gaze directly. I would say experience comes in different forms, Your Honor. I've represented hundreds of clients from every walk of life. I've seen firsthand how judicial decisions affect real people. Not just case outcomes, but lives, families, communities. That's experience you can't get from any law firm or prosecutor's office. When she left the Capitol, Marissa called Judge Winters. How did it go? He asked immediately. I don't know, she admitted. They were tough but fair. The chief judge still seemed skeptical. He's retiring next month, Judge Winters replied. His opinion matters less than it used to. 3 days later, Marissa was in court when her phone buzzed with a text from Judge Winters. Turn on Channel 5 News. Now. She excused herself and hurried to the break room where a small TV was always tuned to the local news. Several attorneys were already gathered around it. On screen, the governor was holding a press conference. Proud to announce my appointment to fill the judicial vacancy in Jackson County. Marissa Bennett brings a wealth of diverse experience and a commitment to equal justice that our courts need. Marissa felt the room spinning. Hands patted her back. Voices offered congratulations, but it all seemed distant, unreal. That evening, alone in her apartment, the reality finally hit her. She would be a judge. At 34, she would be the youngest judge in the county and the first black woman to sit on this bench. She called Grandma Rose, who cried with joy. Your grandfather is dancing in heaven today. Next, she called Judge Winters, who hadn't sounded so happy since his first grandchild was born. The work is just beginning, he warned her, though she could hear the smile in his voice. In the weeks that followed, Marissa prepared for her new role. She read judicial ethics guidelines, studied the court's procedures, and met with each of the other judges who would be her colleagues. Some welcomed her warmly. Others were politely reserved, withholding judgment. One senior judge invited her to lunch and spent the entire time telling war stories about defendants these days, with thinly veiled racist overtones. Marissa listened politely but made mental notes about which kinds of cases she wouldn't want assigned to his courtroom. The night before her swearing-in ceremony, Marissa couldn't sleep. She stood at her window looking out at the city lights, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From that day on the courtroom floor to tomorrow, when she would take the oath of office, she thought about Officer Reynolds, who had knocked her down without a second glance. About Captain Wilson, who had shown her how to navigate the system without losing herself. About Judge Winters, who had seen in her something she hadn't yet seen in herself. Most of all, she thought about what kind of judge she wanted to be. Fair but compassionate, knowledgeable but humble, respectful of the law but never forgetting its impact on human lives. Tomorrow would be a new chapter, not just for her but for everyone who would enter her courtroom seeking justice. She was ready. The morning of Marissa's swearing-in ceremony dawned bright and clear. She'd barely slept, but adrenaline kept her alert as she dressed in the new black suit she'd bought for the occasion. Simple, professional, with a touch of gold at her collar from the small pendant her grandmother had given her. For protection, Rose had said, pressing it into her palm. Grandma Rose was already dressed when Marissa emerged from her bedroom. At 82, Rose moved slowly these days, but she'd been up since 5, too excited to sleep. She wore her best church dress, royal blue with a matching hat, and her eyes shone with pride. Look at you, Rose whispered, taking in the sight of her granddaughter. Judge Bennett, Marissa swallowed hard against the emotion rising in her throat. Not official yet, Grandma. It's been official since the day you were born. Rose replied with absolute certainty. Some people just took longer to see it. The courthouse was packed by 10 o'clock. The ceremony for a new judge wasn't usually such a big event, but Marissa's appointment had attracted attention throughout the community. The first black woman to sit on the county bench, and at such a young age, it was historic. In the front row sat Grandma Rose, her face beaming with pride. Beside her was Judge Winters, retired now but still commanding respect in his perfectly tailored suit. Scattered throughout the crowd were clients Marissa had represented, colleagues from the public defender's office, law school professors, and community members who had come to witness history. At precisely 10:30, the chief judge entered, followed by the other judges of the county, all in their black robes. Marissa, waiting in a side room, took deep breaths to steady her nerves. A court officer appeared at her door. "They're ready for you, Ms. Bennett." As Marissa followed him toward the courtroom, she suddenly recognized his broad shoulders and confident stride. It was Officer Reynolds, the same man who had knocked her down 6 years ago. He still didn't recognize her, still had no idea of the role he'd played in her journey to this moment. The chief judge's voice rang out as she entered. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our newest member of the judiciary, the Honorable Marissa Bennett." The crowd rose as Marissa walked to the front of the courtroom. She kept her eyes forward, her steps measured, her expression composed. But inside, her heart was racing with the significance of this moment, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been knocked down and told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong in these halls of power. The chief judge administered the oath of office, his voice solemn. "Do you, Marissa Bennett, solemnly swear that you will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon you, under the Constitution and laws of this state? So help you God?" Marissa's voice rang clear and strong. "I do." A court officer, not Reynolds but another, stepped forward with the black robe. Judge Winters rose from his seat, asking with a nod for permission to perform this honor. As he helped Marissa into the robe that symbolized her new role, he whispered, "Remember why you're here." Then it was Marissa's turn to speak. She stepped to the podium, looking out at the faces watching her, some friendly, some curious, some still skeptical. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, "particularly my grandmother Rose, who raised me to believe that justice isn't just a word but an action. And Judge Winters, who showed me that power can be used to lift others up, not just hold them down." She paused, gathering her thoughts. 6 years ago, I was knocked to the ground in this very courtroom. A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't the typical polite, impersonal speech expected at such ceremonies. I was a law student, here to observe and learn. During a disturbance, a court officer knocked me down in his rush to respond. She looked directly at Officer Reynolds, who now stood at attention by the door, his expression frozen as recognition finally dawned. He never stopped to help me up, never looked back to see if I was hurt. In that moment, I was invisible, just an obstacle in the way of what he considered justice. The courtroom was utterly silent now. That experience taught me something important about our system, about who is seen and who is overlooked, about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't, about who the system serves and who it often fails. Marissa smoothed her hands over her new robe. "I stand before you today not in spite of that experience, but because of it. It showed me exactly why I needed to be here, why perspectives like mine need to be represented on this bench." She looked at Judge Winters, who nodded slightly, encouragingly. "Justice isn't just about applying the law correctly, though that matters enormously. It's also about seeing people, really seeing them, in all their humanity, with all their flaws and strengths and circumstances. It's about understanding that the same action can have profoundly different impacts depending on who you are and where you stand." Marissa's eyes swept the room. "In my courtroom, everyone will be seen. Everyone will be heard. The law will be applied fairly and consistently, not according to who has the most expensive attorney or the most familiar face or the most privileged background." She could see Officer Reynolds shifting uncomfortably by the door. Captain Wilson, now retired but present for the ceremony, was nodding slightly, a hint of a smile on her face. "I take this responsibility seriously, to uphold the law while acknowledging its imperfections, to deliver justice while working to make it more just. I will make mistakes. All judges do. But I promise to approach each case with integrity, humility, and an unwavering commitment to equal justice under law. Marissa concluded with a simple, "Thank you," stepping back as applause filled the courtroom. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the courthouse atrium. Marissa moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, exchanging brief words with colleagues and community members. As the crowd thinned, Officer Reynolds approached her. He looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence absent. "Judge Bennett," he said stiffly. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," Marissa replied evenly. He cleared his throat. "About what you said. About being knocked down. That was me, wasn't it?" "It was." He shifted his weight, clearly uncertain what to say next. "I don't remember it." I'm sorry." Marissa studied him for a moment. "That's part of the problem, isn't it? What seems insignificant to one person can change the entire course of another's life." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Judge, I mean. You'll be working in my courtroom sometimes," Marissa said. "I'll expect everyone there to be treated with dignity. Everyone." "Yes, Judge." He hesitated, then added, "I'll do better." As Reynolds walked away, Judge Winters appeared at Marissa's side. "Well handled," he said quietly. Not vindictive, but not letting him off the hook either. "I learned from the best," Marissa replied with a small smile. Later that afternoon, after the reception ended and most people had gone, Marissa returned to what was now her courtroom. She stood behind the bench, looking out at the empty seats where soon people would sit awaiting her decisions. Decisions that could change their lives, for better or worse. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the judge's bench, remembering how it felt to lie on the floor of this same room, looking up. The journey from that moment to this one had been neither direct nor easy. But perhaps that's what made her ready for this role, not despite the obstacles but because of them. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Grandma Rose leaning on her cane. "There you are," Rose said, making her way slowly to the front of the courtroom. "Hiding from your own party?" Marissa smiled, just taking a moment to let it all sink in. Rose looked around the courtroom, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandfather said something to me once back when things were really hard for our people. He said, 'Rose, justice is like water. It'll find a way through any crack, any opening. Our job is to keep making those openings bigger.'" Marissa came down from the bench to stand beside her grandmother, taking the older woman's weathered hand in hers. "You've made quite an opening today," Rose continued, "but the hard part's just beginning." "I know," Marissa acknowledged. "There will be resistance, pushback, people who think I don't belong here." Rose squeezed her hand. "And you'll face them just like you faced that officer today. With dignity, with truth, with your head held high." Together they walked slowly out of the courtroom, Marissa's black robe flowing behind her, the weight of it still unfamiliar, but already feeling right. Tomorrow she would return to begin her first official day as Judge Marissa Bennett. There would be cases to hear, decisions to make, justice to deliver. And when Officer Reynolds or anyone else looked at her now, they wouldn't see someone to overlook or push aside. They would see the power of rising up, of perseverance, of turning obstacles into stepping stones. They would see the judge,